I was halfway through a deployment in the Middle East when the email came through. No warning, no build-up. Just subject line, divorce. Inside, she wrote that after 15 years of marriage she was done. She'd already emptied our joint account and moved a new man into the house we built together. She didn't ask. She informed. It read more like a business transaction than the dismantling of a life. At the end, she wrote that I should be an adult about it. I stared at the words on my screen, surrounded by sand, steel, and the constant hum of generators. My only reply was one word. I typed, understood. Then I shut the laptop and went back to work like nothing had happened. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 42 years old, a staff sergeant with the 82nd Airborne. For 2 decades I lived by structure, by orders, by discipline. I never raised my voice unless I had to. I didn't panic when things went sideways. I executed. That morning, my marriage collapsed with a single email. And like any mission, I knew my response couldn't be emotional. It had to be strategic. On the surface, nothing changed. I still trained with my squad, still ran patrols, still kept my gear squared away. No one around me knew my world had split open. I didn't vent, didn't ask for sympathy. I wrote 3 words on the back page of my notebook: freeze, track, respond. That was how we handled combat situations. It was also how I would handle this. When I got back to my quarters that night, I checked our accounts. She wasn't lying. Every dollar was gone, down to the cents. Nearly $74,000 drained in one day. She must have been planning it for months. Mortgage payments set to autopay were already canceled. My name was still on the loan, but she was cutting herself free of every tether while I was 9,000 miles away. I pulled up property records. Our house in Fayetteville was still under both our names, but she had already filed temporary occupancy through the divorce papers. That meant her new boyfriend was living in the home I'd paid for, the one I'd built with my bare hands on weekends off duty. He was sleeping in my bed while I was racking out in a cot overseas. The rage I felt was quiet. Not loud, not explosive. Quiet, like steel being sharpened. That night, I didn't drink. I didn't shout. I studied. Divorce laws, military protections, property rights. I found the Service Members Civil Relief Act. It meant she couldn't finalize anything without me having a fair shot to respond, even if I was deployed. She thought distance made me powerless. She was wrong. I closed my laptop at 0300, leaned back on the thin mattress, and felt calm. She believed she had cut me out of my own life. What she didn't realize was that I had already begun the kind of operation she couldn't even imagine. By the time she understood, it would be far too late. The morning after her email, I woke before dawn, not from an alarm, but from the kind of cold clarity that comes only after betrayal. My squad was still asleep, their breathing heavy in the barracks. I slipped on my boots and stepped outside into the desert air. The horizon was just beginning to glow, and I made a decision. If she wanted a war, I'd fight it the way I fought everything else, quietly, methodically, and with precision she could never anticipate. I started by locking down what little I still controlled. Our joint account was empty, but I still had my military pay funneling into it. I changed the routing overnight, redirecting every future deposit into a new account under my name only. She might have drained the past, but the future was mine again. Then I pulled every statement for the last 12 months, line by line. What I found confirmed what I suspected. Withdrawals timed too neatly, purchases that weren't ours, small test transfers leading up to the big sweep. She hadn't acted in desperation. She had executed a plan. That was fine. I had plans too. When the deployment schedule allowed, I used the satellite connection to access county records back home. Property deeds, vehicle registrations, tax filings, everything I could gather without raising alarms. On paper, our house was still half mine. She had filed for divorce, but the court hadn't touched the deed. Her new boyfriend might be living under that roof, but legally, he was trespassing in my home. That detail mattered. I filed copies of every record into encrypted folders, backed up twice, once to the cloud, once to a drive I kept hidden. Years in the service had taught me that redundancy was survival. Lose one copy, you always had another. And if she thought I'd left everything in her hands, she was about to learn that soldiers don't walk away from the battlefield, they prepare it. At chow that evening, one of the guys asked me why I looked so focused lately. I just shrugged. I wasn't about to spill my private war in front of men carrying their own battles. But the truth was, my silence wasn't emptiness. It was pressure, building slowly, like a mine waiting under the soil. That night, I reached out to an old friend stateside, Tyler, a fellow soldier turned attorney. I didn't give details. I just asked him to keep an eye out for filings under my name. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't explain. That was enough. By the time I closed my laptop again, I knew the terrain. She thought she had cut me off at the knees. What she didn't understand was that every decision she made left a trace. And I was tracing all of it. She believed I was powerless because I was 9,000 miles away. But distance doesn't weaken discipline. It sharpens it. And by the time I came home, the battlefield would already be mine. Weeks slipped by, but my war never left my mind. Patrols, drills, mission briefs. They filled the hours, but every spare moment belonged to my quiet campaign back home. Each time I opened my laptop, I found another piece of the puzzle she thought I would never see. The first break came from a casual detail. On one of her online filings, I noticed a second name listed as co-occupant of our house. Not his legal signature, just an address update buried in a property tax form. The name was Derek Malone. At first, it meant nothing, but I ran it through databases accessible through old contacts, and the picture sharpened fast. Derek wasn't just some stranger. He was someone I had met years earlier at a barbecue, a neighbor down the street who had always lingered too long in conversation with my wife. Back then, I dismissed it as politeness. Now, I saw it for what it was, a seed that had been watered the moment I deployed. Digging deeper, I discovered that Derek had a spotty work history. Odd jobs, short contracts, debts trailing him like shadows. He wasn't moving into my house because he had earned it. He was moving in because he had found someone willing to bankroll his life. And that someone had been siphoning $74,000 of my money into his pocket. I didn't rage. I didn't send threats. Instead, I mapped every debt Derek had left unpaid. Traffic tickets, late credit payments, liens filed in small claims courts. His record was a roadmap of irresponsibility, and I traced every mile of it. My training had always been about identifying weaknesses, where an enemy was exposed, where the armor was thin. Derek's life was nothing but exposed edges. One night, I reached out again to Tyler, my attorney friend. I asked him to quietly monitor Derek's name alongside mine. He said nothing, but I could tell by the pause that he understood. That was enough. From there, I shifted to my wife's patterns. She had changed our insurance policies, pulled me off the primary coverage, added Derek as a household resident. It was sloppy, reckless. Every change left documentation, and every piece of documentation became another nail in her coffin. I downloaded copies of everything, layered them into my growing archive. The more I gathered, the calmer I became. This wasn't about lashing out or making noise. It was about building a case so airtight no judge could ignore it. She believed she had cornered me, but she had left fingerprints on every move she made. And Derek, her knight in shining armor, was nothing but a liability waiting to be exposed. When I shut down my laptop that night, I wrote 4 words at the top of my notebook. They buried themselves early. It wasn't bravado. It was fact. They had built their new life on sand, and all I had to do was wait for the tide. By the time my deployment hit the 5-month mark, my personal war had become a second mission. I didn't need weapons. My tools were records, statutes, and silence. Every time she or Derek made a move, they left behind another piece of evidence. All I had to do was follow the trail. Through Tyler, I learned she had filed for an expedited divorce. She wanted the court to push it through before I rotated home. But the Service Members' Civil Relief Act was clear. No judge could finalize proceedings without giving me time to respond. She either hadn't read the law or assumed I wouldn't. That assumption became my leverage. Tyler filed an objection on my behalf, quietly, formally, shutting down her attempt before it even left the clerk's desk. She probably thought I hadn't noticed. She was wrong. Next, I focused on Derek. His debts weren't just personal embarrassments. They were legal vulnerabilities. I found a string of unpaid fines in neighboring counties. Tyler arranged to have those cases refreshed and enforced. It wasn't sabotage. It was simply shining a light on what Derek had buried. The result was predictable. Warrants for unpaid tickets, notices piling up at my house, his name dragged into collections. From 9,000 miles away, I had turned his new life with my wife into a financial minefield. Meanwhile, I studied her spending. With access to old statements, I tracked the trail of every dollar she had drained. Hotels, restaurants, jewelry. Nothing extravagant enough to scream fraud, but consistent, reckless. It painted her not as a victim escaping a marriage, but as someone who had used my absence to bankroll another man. I documented every transaction, compiling a ledger that no court could ignore. At night, under the hum of the barracks generator, I refined the plan. Step 1. Secure my assets. Step 2. Discredit their stability. Step 3. Prepare for custody and property hearings that would come when I returned stateside. Each step required patience. And patience was something I had more of than either of them. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the desert horizon, I checked my email again. She had sent a message, short and smug. She wrote that I should stop resisting, that the house was hers now, that I should accept reality. I didn't answer. I added it to the growing folder labeled evidence. Every word she sent was a gift, another proof of intent, another rope she was tightening around her own neck. When lights out came, I lay on my cot staring at the ceiling. Around me, soldiers snored, exhausted from the day. My mind stayed sharp, clear. She thought she had left me stranded, powerless. What she didn't understand was that distance hadn't weakened me. It had given me time. Time to think, time to prepare, time to let their own mistakes pile up until they couldn't climb out. By the time I returned, the battle wouldn't just be about betrayal. It would be about control. And I had already taken it back without lifting my voice. When my deployment ended, I stepped off the plane into the cool North Carolina air with one duffel bag and a head full of plans. Families crowded the hangar, hugging, crying, welcoming home their soldiers. I stood quietly off to the side. No one was waiting for me. That was fine. I had other priorities. The next morning, I drove past the house that still carried my name on the deed. The lawn was overgrown, weeds creeping across the walkway I used to trim every weekend. Her car sat in the driveway, and beside it, a truck I didn't recognize. Derek's. My first instinct was to park, to walk up, to claim what was mine. Instead, I kept driving. Confrontation wasn't my weapon. Timing was. I didn't need to knock on that door. I already owned half of what was inside. At Tyler's office, I reviewed the files we'd compiled. The expedited divorce had been blocked. The drained accounts were fully documented. Derek's debts had multiplied under the pressure of enforcement. And the best part, every reckless purchase my wife had made with our money now stood as evidence of marital waste, the kind that judges don't ignore. Tyler explained it calmly. By the time hearings began, she wouldn't be asking what she got to keep. She would be asking what she had left. That afternoon, I returned to base housing and sat at the small desk in the corner. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the photos I had received from a private investigator Tyler had hired. Images of my wife and Derek at restaurants, walking out of stores with bags, lounging in the backyard of the home that still carried my mortgage. Each photo was time-stamped, logged, preserved. They weren't smoking guns, but they painted a clear picture. She hadn't left me for survival. She had left me for convenience. That night, she finally reached out again. This time it wasn't smug. Her tone had shifted. She wrote that she was open to negotiating, that we could avoid court if I signed quickly. I read it twice, then closed the message without reply. She had no idea what was already coming. Silence was my answer, and silence was the weapon she never understood. The next day, I filed my official response to the divorce. Not a rejection, not a plea. A detailed counterclaim backed by every shred of evidence we had collected. It wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It was a scalpel sliding across the facade of her new life. When I left the courthouse, the air felt lighter. I didn't smile, didn't celebrate. I simply walked to my truck, started the engine, and drove away. My war wasn't finished, but the battlefield had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't the one making moves. I was. And by the time she realized how deep my silence ran, it would be far too late to recover. The first court hearing arrived faster than I expected. The judge's calendar had cleared, and suddenly I found myself sitting in a wood-paneled room across from the woman I had once called my wife. She didn't meet my eyes. Beside her sat Derek, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit. His jaw was tight, his shoulders too stiff. They looked like a pair holding on to a story already unraveling. I sat quietly, my attorney doing most of the talking. He laid out the facts like an architect placing blueprints on a table. Bank withdrawals, property records, receipts. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. He simply presented. Every line he read was another cut into the life they had tried to build out of my money. Her lawyer attempted to spin it. He painted her as a woman abandoned, struggling alone, forced to make hard choices while I was overseas. But the documents told another story. Trips to the coast, designer purchases, bar tabs stretching into the hundreds, and Derek's debts now tied to her household, stacking like bricks on a sinking ship. The judge leaned back, silent, flipping through the exhibits. He asked no questions, but I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't buying her story. He was measuring the weight of mine. When the hearing ended, no decision was made, but the silence in that courtroom was louder than any ruling. She walked out first, her head down, Derek following behind like a shadow. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Outside, Tyler told me the momentum had shifted. The judge had already ordered a freeze on remaining assets until the case concluded. That meant no more draining accounts, no more hiding money. Every dollar was now under watch. She wouldn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. That night, another message came through. This one wasn't smug or bargaining. It was angry. She accused me of ambushing her, of turning the court against her, of making her look foolish. She wrote that Derek was furious, that I had humiliated him. I didn't reply. I saved it, filed it, and shut the screen. Anger was just another mistake documented in her own words. The next morning, I drove past the house again. Derek's truck was gone, her car still there. A notice from the county was taped to the front door, one of his unpaid fines catching up to him. I pulled over long enough to take a photo. Another thread in the record. Another quiet strike. As I sat behind the wheel, watching the house I once called home, I realized something. They thought this was a fight for property, for money, for pride. But it wasn't. It was a lesson in patience. Every move they made, every word they spoke, every dollar they spent became another brick in the case I was building. I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to explain myself. All I had to do was keep watching, keep collecting, and keep moving in silence. And silence was winning. By summer, the pressure was showing in ways I didn't even need to imagine. Every new filing, every notice, every subpoena was another weight dragging them down. I didn't need to confront them. The system was doing it for me, brick by brick. I learned through Tyler that Derek had been forced to appear in small claims court for one of his unpaid debts. He hadn't shown up, which meant the judgment went through without resistance. His wages, if he had any steady ones, were now subject to garnishment. The court order became public record. I clipped it, filed it, and added it to the folder. It wasn't just evidence. It was erosion, slowly eating away at the life they tried to build. My wife, ex-wife by then, though the court hadn't finalized, was scrambling. Her lawyer had tried to negotiate again, this time softer, suggesting mediation. I declined. I didn't need mediation. I needed patience. She had underestimated that from the beginning. Soldiers know how to wait longer than anyone else. Around that time, Stephen, a buddy who still lived near Fayetteville, called me. He said he'd seen Derek at a bar, drunk, ranting about how unfair life was, how he'd been dragged into something he couldn't control. I didn't respond to Stephen's story. I didn't need to. Derek was unraveling, and unraveling men make mistakes. Another hearing came, and this time, the judge ruled on temporary occupancy. He gave me joint rights to the house, citing that I was still paying part of the mortgage and that her new household resident contributed nothing. She looked shocked. Derek looked like he'd been slapped. The order didn't remove them, but it cracked the illusion that the house was theirs alone. The following week, I drove by again. The lawn had grown worse, the blinds half closed in the middle of the day. Her car was gone. Derek's truck sat crooked in the driveway. I stayed parked across the street long enough to see him step outside, shirtless, arguing on the phone, pacing like a man caged. I didn't linger. Just one photo through the windshield, time-stamped. Then I drove away. Another quiet record of the collapse. She sent another message that night. This one was short, frantic. She wrote that I was destroying everything, that I needed to stop before we all go down. I saved it like I had saved the others. Each email, each text, each word she sent in desperation became part of the silent archive. She thought her anger might scare me. She forgot who I was, where I had come from. Fear doesn't land on men who've carried rifles in foreign deserts. By then, the outcome wasn't in doubt. The only question left was how far they would fall before the ground caught them. I didn't have to answer. I just had to keep building the silence around them until they heard nothing else. The final stretch of the divorce proceedings played out like a slow-motion collapse. By then, my role was simple. Sit, listen, and let the records do the talking. Every hearing was another nail in the coffin of the story she tried to spin. Her lawyer pushed hard, painting Derek as a stable partner and my wife as someone simply seeking happiness after years of being neglected during deployments. But the evidence shredded that image. The bank records showed her draining accounts before filing. The receipts showed spending sprees that didn't match survival, they matched indulgence. And Derek's mounting debts showed he wasn't supporting her. He was draining her. The judge listened in silence, flipping through exhibit after exhibit. When her lawyer tried to argue she needed the house for security, Tyler countered with the order already giving me equal rights to the property. When they argued that Derek contributed to household expenses, Tyler produced the small claims judgments proving he had no steady income. Each point landed like a hammer, steady, undeniable. By the second week of testimony, the cracks were visible on her face. She walked into court with tight lips, eyes darting. Derek stopped showing up altogether, leaving her alone at the table. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. My silence weighed more than any glare could. The ruling came on a rainy Thursday. The judge awarded me majority of the marital assets, citing her reckless spending as marital waste. The house was ordered to be sold, with proceeds split unevenly in my favor. She kept her car, her personal belongings, and not much else. Custody wasn't an issue. Our kids were grown, but the financial blow was devastating. Derek's name never appeared in the ruling, but his fingerprints were all over the wreckage. When court adjourned, she sat frozen, papers in her hands, as if the weight of them was too much to lift. I stood, collected my folder, and walked out without a word. Outside, Tyler asked if I felt vindicated. I told him it wasn't about vindication. It was about balance. The scales had been tilted for too long, and now they'd been set right. That evening, she sent one final message. It was short, broken. She wrote that she hadn't expected me to fight back, that she thought distance meant weakness. She ended with, "You never even raised your voice." She was right. I hadn't. And that silence had been louder than anything she could imagine. I read it once, archived it, and closed my laptop. The war was finished, not with shouting, not with revenge, but with precision. She had built her new life on lies and arrogance. I had dismantled it with patience and quiet calculation. By then, I understood the truth. I hadn't just survived betrayal. I had turned it into my battlefield. And I had walked off that battlefield without a scratch. After the ruling, I didn't go back to the house. The court ordered it sold, and I let the process unfold without my hand on it. But word has a way of traveling in small towns, and Fayetteville wasn't large enough to hide what was happening inside those walls. Stephen called me one evening, his voice low, almost hesitant. He said Derek had been kicked out of a bar downtown after picking a fight he couldn't win. Drunk, angry, shouting about how the system had ruined him. Stephen said my ex-wife had shown up an hour later, trying to calm him down in the parking lot. No one listened. People had already made up their minds about them. I just nodded, even though Stephen couldn't see me. Their unraveling wasn't news. It was inevitable. The realtor handling the sale called weeks later. She said the house was in rough shape. Weeds knee-high in the yard, dishes stacked inside, repairs neglected. She asked if I wanted to walk through before listing. I declined. I didn't need to see what they had done to it. That house had been mine in memory long before they ruined it in reality. The only thing I wanted from it now was the check when it sold. When the sale finally closed, the numbers came through exactly as Tyler predicted. My share was larger than hers, the judge's ruling in black and white. She had fought to keep control, and in the end, she had lost it all. The money she drained was gone, burned through months of trying to play house with a man who couldn't even pay his own tickets. Not long after, I heard Derek had left town. He didn't move far, just enough to disappear into another small rental in another small county. His debts followed him. They always would. My ex-wife stayed behind, her car still parked in driveways where neighbors looked the other way. Her life had shrunk from our house to a small apartment, the kind of place she once swore she'd never live in again. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching someone implode under the weight of their own choices isn't a victory lap. It's just gravity. One night, another email arrived. This time, there was no anger in her words. No bargaining. Just a single line. I didn't think silence could be this loud. I read it twice, archived it with the rest, and shut down the screen. By then, I no longer cared about what she thought. The war had been fought, the outcome written. My silence had broken her more completely than rage ever could. I sat on my porch that evening with a glass of water, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. She had tried to cut me down while I was 9,000 miles away. But I came home stronger, sharper, and untouchable. She had gambled everything on my weakness. And all she found was a man who knew how to wait. The day the divorce was finalized, I walked out of the courthouse into crisp autumn air. The leaves in Fayetteville had started to turn gold and red against the gray sky. People moved past me, carrying on with their lives, unaware that mine had just closed a chapter 15 years in the making. There was no cheering, no relief, just a quiet finality. Papers stamped, signatures filed, the line between us officially cut. I drove back to my small rented place on the edge of town and sat on the porch with nothing but the sound of wind moving through the trees. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for another email, another notice, another strike from the shadows. It was over. She had taken her shot, and she had missed. The silence she left behind was mine to keep. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding, not just finances, but myself. The house sale had given me enough to reset. I invested carefully, opened accounts she would never touch, created a foundation she could never shake. My military pay was steady, and for the first time in years, it felt like mine alone. Every dollar represented distance from the chaos she tried to drag me into. I still heard whispers about her and Derek. Their life together shrank by the day. Neighbors said they fought constantly, the money gone, the debts rising, their bond fraying under the weight of consequences. I didn't check on them. I didn't need updates. Their collapse wasn't my concern anymore. Gravity was doing its work. One evening, Emily, my daughter from my first marriage, called. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was better than okay. I told her the truth. I was free. She said she was proud of me for not losing myself in anger. I didn't correct her. Anger had been there, but it had been silent, cold, turned into calculation instead of noise. I thought back to the night I received that first email overseas. Her words cutting like a blade. Divorce. Joint account emptied. Be an adult about it. I remembered typing my single-word reply. Understood. At the time, she thought it was weakness, a man accepting defeat from 9,000 miles away. She never realized it was the first step in the plan that would undo her completely. Now, sitting alone on my porch with the cool night air settling in, I understood something deeper. I hadn't won by shouting. I hadn't won by threatening. I had won by waiting, by documenting, by letting silence become a weapon sharper than any rage. She had gambled on my distance. She had gambled on my silence. And in the end, both were the very things that destroyed her. Some men fight back loud. I didn't. I fought quietly, precisely, and when the time came, I ended it without raising my voice. That's how you survive betrayal. That's how you win. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.